So without further ado, just the normal slide presenting the EBC. This year is actually our 50th anniversary, and we are the trade policy arm of the European Chambers of Commerce here in Japan. I sometimes say that we're an interface between companies and government. While I can't necessarily speak on behalf of the chambers, but perhaps they present us, they're an interface between companies, but we're an interface between companies and government. So the chambers also make up a board and also partially fund the EBC. I say partially because we're also funded by direct membership, so companies. And these companies, it's from them that we get the technical expertise and also the inputs on what we should advocate for. The companies also make up, or our members also make up our committees, which are 22 at the moment, and they cover almost all industry sectors. We don't represent pharma because there's a particular European pharma organization here in Japan. And then just see the last point is just on some of the successes that we have throughout the year. The top one being the EPA itself. So just what is an FTA or an EPA, or in general, a preferential trade agreement or arrangement, because they can take many shapes and forms. Just a few words on what is an FTA or an EPA or any other free trade arrangement. And I will actually start from the bottom, as I said. So a free trade agreement is an agreement that offers what's called I see that I missed a P, so it should read preferential treatment. In simple terms, for instance, it offers a lower tariff to the partner, or a zero duty, come to think of it, to the partner. There are some limitations to this, and that's why I've also written rules of origin, but they're specific to the parties that are part of the agreement. So naturally, the EU-Japan agreement gives benefits to Japan and EU, the member states. They don't necessarily have to be symmetrical. You can give different things. I would say that most FTAs are actually in some way asymmetric. So Japan have not necessarily given the same thing as the EU to Japan, and of course vice versa, but that's fairly common. They can also be completely unilateral, where, for instance, we have agreements where only one party gives to the other side without receiving anything in return. Many of these agreements are, for instance, where you offer benefits to developing countries. Both the EU and Japan have those. But let's not get stuck in this, but we'll continue with a bit of a history lesson. So before we had the EPA, it wasn't that EU and Japan had no trade relations or no formal relations at all. There were indeed some what we call dialogues, and one of them was the regulatory reform dialogue, which carried on for 10 years. It was set up in the, let's say, in the mid-90s, and went on for 11 or 12 years. However, during Trade Commissioner Mandelson, his mandate period, and we're talking about mid-2000, the Commission saw that the WTO track had slightly gotten stuck, and were therefore putting more efforts on the bilateral, what's called the bilateral tracks. So basically FTAs with bilateral partners. At the same time, the Commission also drafted an Asia strategy. It was just that this Asia strategy mentioned more or less every name every country in Asia except for Japan. And this was sort of the starting point for EBC to get very active in this field. So the EBC sent a letter to the commissioner saying that any Asia strategy has to have Japan at its center. And that was sort of how it started. The idea that we had back then was a trade arrangement that was mirrored or based upon the internal market. So basically, if one could put it in simple terms, if a product is approved for sale or marketing in one market, let's take just EU, you should be able to market it in the other market, Japan, and of course vice versa, without the need for additional testing, approvals, and whatnot. And this would, of course, also cover tariffs. And as you see, our focus was that it shouldn't just be on what is usually a traditional FTA, so tariff reductions, but also what sometimes is referred to as non-tariff barriers or non-tariff measures. As Japan, for industrial goods in general, have fairly low tariffs, so it would have been difficult to share sort of one by one. And this we called an economic integration agreement. Actually, Keidan and every once in a while still uses this phrase. So exactly what did we do in the very beginning? I did say, as I mentioned, that we sent a letter to Commissioner Mandelson saying that any Asia strategy has to have Japan at the center. At this time, actually, the Commission wasn't necessarily convinced that starting negotiations for an FTA with Japan was a good idea. And I think there were sort of two reasons for this. One was that the Commission wasn't convinced that Japan would be able to offer to the EU what we were interested in, since many of those things that we, both as EU and of course the industry, were interested were not tariff issues, but rather non-tariff issues, regulations, standards, competition legislation, and so on and so forth. The other issue was also that the Commission at the time were busy with starting and later on also conducting negotiations with Korea. So it was just difficult with resources for the Commission. On the other hand, Japan was very keen on starting the negotiations with the EU. And I think the main reason was that they saw the writing on the wall that with the EU-Korea agreement, Korea would get improved market access, especially for passenger cars and for consumer electronics, where, as you hopefully now see on my shared screen, EU has a 10% import duty on passenger cars and slightly depending on the specific product, up to 17% on consumer electronics. I should also say that there were opposition from some European industry sectors as well. So that didn't make it very easy for the EBC, at least in the beginning. So what did we do? We will talk about the white paper before, but we changed the white paper so that it, for a couple of years, exclusively focused on what we thought should be included in the future FTA negotiations. And of course, also what we wanted out of the FTA negotiation. As I mentioned before, Japan were, of course, keen on this, but their interests were in a couple of limited sectors, meaning that we had to convince the Japanese government and its business association. So I mentioned Keidan, but also, of course, JAMA, which is the Japanese Automobile Association, JETA, which is the Electronics Association, Ikiren, which is the Medical Device Association here in Japan, so that they saw the benefit and also that they understood exactly what they needed to push the Japanese government, so that in turn the Japanese government would be willing to put certain things on the negotiating tables. And I have mentioned just a couple of those that are not related to tariffs. Again, SPS is the regulations surrounding food and other agricultural products, also, of course, beverages. Could be public procurement, maritime logistics, and so on, competition legislation, and so on and so forth. Also, the EU-Japan Business Roundtable, which is made up of Japanese industry and European industry, which meets once a year to give recommendations to EU and Japanese regulations. We managed to get them to further look into this issue and also partially support it. The EBC also produced a fairly thick paper, actually, that detailed some of the issues, not just identifying the issues, but also giving technical background, which are the legislations, which are the regulations that need to be changed in order to change this. And also during what's called a scoping exercise, this is an exercise that the Commission does before negotiations for any free trade agreement, where we produced a list of about 200 issues that European companies or European industry faced here in Japan. And that included background legal basis and, of course, also solution or solutions. Just continuing the history lessons. So officially, the first thing that happened in regards to the EPA was the EU-Japan summit in 2009. I think it was held in Prague, actually. I think it was the Czech Republic who held the presidency back then. In the joint statement, in paragraph or article 34, it talked about that the parties should look into integrating the economies more. And this was basically officially the starting point, the very, very first starting point of what then later became the EPA. And as you can see on the screen, studies were made in 2009 and 2010 on the economic benefits. So this was outsourced to a Danish consultancy. So they made an economic study that showed, they set up, I think it was 4 scenarios, and showed that independent on which of these scenarios you choose, there will be a benefit. But the biggest benefit is the more you include and the further and deeper you go in the agreement. So the more benefits basically you get and receive. In May 2011, the European Parliament adopts a resolution supporting the idea of an EU-Japan FTA. And about the time, as you see, I'm jumping back and forth here a little bit, the European Commission starts its scoping exercise, which is concluded in May 2011. Not too long after that, the Commission asks for a negotiating mandate from the member states, and this is done via the EU Council, the European Council rather. A negotiating mandate sets out what the member states and also the Commission thinks they will be able to achieve through the negotiations, but it also sets out what is called red lines. Those are lines that the Commission in the negotiations are not allowed to step over. For instance, it's an actual example. One of the red lines says that EU will not give benefits regarding whale meat, for instance. It wouldn't surprise me if we look at Japan, one of the red lines for the Japanese negotiators would be inclusion of rice, for instance, or konjac roots. And then negotiations were officially launched in March 2013, and the first round was held just a month after that. Now I will skip forward quite a lot. There were 18 rounds held, and also so-called intersessional meetings. The, the difference between a rounded and a sessional meeting is it's a bit vague, but in practice, it's basically a round, and this is internal EU regulation. After a round, the Commission actually had to present what was discussed and so on, which Japan actually wasn't too happy about. That's why the format changed a bit at the end. So instead it became intersessional meetings, and there were no official presentation after each of those. Anyway, the negotiations were finalized in December 2017. And then, as you can see, after legal review and translation, the agreement was sent to the European Council, April 2018, and approved 6th of July 2018. And then the very last thing that happened was that the EU-Japan EP entered into 1st of February 2019, now 3 years ago. So what did the EBC do during the negotiations? Because we talked a little bit about what the EBC did before the negotiations. So due to a fairly specific position here, because we're in Japan, our members are companies that face, whether we call it issues, problems, challenges on a daily basis. So that puts us in a very special position in being able to provide the negotiators, so the European Commission, with technical information that includes the background of the issue, legal references, and then, of course, also perhaps more importantly, a possible solution to the problem. It, of course, also includes giving priorities, what we believe are important for European industry in Japan. I should say that this is something all business associations do, so I'm certain our friends that happen to be based in Europe, the various business associations there, did exactly the same thing. The difference is, of course, that we're here in Japan. And this was done for almost all sectors, again, not for pharma, and also for all fields of policy, whether that be tariffs, food, agriculture, antitrust, competition, public procurement, maritime, logistics, and so on and so forth. So this also naturally means that quite a lot of people within the EBC are involved. I should say the secretariat itself is fairly small, so we very much are dependent on our members. And again, they represent a number of companies in a number of sectors, which meant that we could draw on their expertise. We also lobbied the Japanese government to agree to at least negotiate certain sensitive sectors, such as, for instance, public procurement, maritime, SPS, so food and agricultural related regulations. And I think this was important also to convey the message to the European Commission, the negotiators, that it is actually possible to get this out from the negotiations from the Japanese. As you might remember in the beginning of my presentations, one of the concerns from the Commission was that Japan wouldn't be able to put certain things on the table. As I said, the EPA entered into force 1st of February 2019, but that was and still isn't the end of the EPA. Just basically on the first day or the second day, some issues were brought up to light. And I think one of the biggest issue, as you can see, was the so-called rules of origin. Rules of origin are those rules that set out what kind of process a product needs to have undergone to be considered EU or Japan origin. Let me just take an example. Let's say that I import something from China into, now I'm sitting in Japan, so I guess to Japan, and then I export it to EU. That product will not be able to make use of the EU-Japan agreement because the product is basically not produced in Japan. It's not just as, it's neither as easy just to import something into Japan and maybe repaint it and export it to EU in order to use, and then also be able to use the agreement. So the rules of origin basically set out what kind of processes, what kind of transformation does imported products, so products that do not come from EU nor from Japan, what kind of products, what kind of transformation they need to have undergone. Let's take a car as an example. As we know, a car is made up of 1,000 different products, and they might come from different places, whether it's tires, wheels, steering wheels, and whatnot. I'm not a car expert, as you can hear, so I don't necessarily know the car parts. But as part of this, you need to certify that our product is considered to be of EU or Japan origin. And there was a bit of a problem where the Japanese authorities starting to ask for more information. So basically the exporter usually issues what's called a statement on origin. The importer uses this in order to ask for a reduced tariff or a zero tariff, depending on the product. And that should have been the end of the story. However, the Japanese, basically Japan Customs, asked for additional information from the importer, exactly how this product was produced. Now that might be confidential information, it might be information that the importer doesn't have, and so on and so forth. So quite a lot of companies were not able to import into Japan the products using the agreement. It doesn't mean that you cannot import the product. It just means that unfortunately you will have to pay the normal duty. So this was flagged very, very early on. Fortunately, the Commission was very interested in this. So the problem was solved fairly quickly. And today we rarely hear about this. But these are issues that, for better or for worse, you can't necessarily see until the agreement actually enters into force. The same thing regarding public procurement. If you have anyone in the audience, for instance, from the wind power industry, you may be aware of that. Japan is, of course, trying to increase its use of renewable energy, and part of that is, of course, wind power. Hence, they're setting up public procurement to get companies to invest or to construct windmills, whether they're onshore or offshore. And as part of this public procurement, there's a point system in order to be able to award the contract to a certain company. Unfortunately, as part of this point system, more points were given to experience in Japan and experience overseas, which goes against the spirit of the agreement. This was also something that was raised and improved upon. The last one is just tariff rate quotas. This usually applies to certain food products or agricultural products where the administration wasn't necessarily optimal. Not wanting to get too technical, what I want to point out is that just because an agreement has entered into force, it doesn't mean that it's all good. It has to be monitored. And that's one thing that the EBC continues to do. And I think also, thankfully, the European Commission is also very interested in this, because they want the agreement to be not only a good agreement, but actually want companies and industry to use it. So we're receiving quite a bit of support from them. The agreement is also a so-called live agreement. So it's possible to add new things. These can be, for instance, new technologies that weren't covered when the agreement was negotiated. It can be new policy areas. So, for instance, data transfer is such an agreement. Such a policy area. During the negotiations, this was still a very new policy area, so it wasn't actually included in the agreement. It has been added as a standalone agreement afterwards. So that's partially what the EBC continues to do, to push for new issues to be added, but also to solve those issues that might not have worked out perfectly. Moving on to the EBC White Paper. So we have an EBC White Paper where each of our committees present their issues, and more importantly, the recommendations to deal with these issues. And we have published it for actually over 20 years. What is new for this year, that it's no longer a printed white paper, but it's actually a completely digital white paper, so you can find it on our homepage. It covers all sectors, and I've talked up until now that we always exclude the pharmaceutical sector because we don't represent that. However, the white paper actually includes the pharmaceutical sector as well, because FPA, this European Pharma Organization here in Japan, they actually provide us with their contribution. And the white paper is, of course, not just to produce it, it actually needs to be used. So this is perhaps one of our major tools to advocate for change here in Japan. So it's handed over, I was about to say handed over left and right, but it's handed over, of course, to the Japanese administration, but also the political leadership, the business organizations on the European side, and then, of course, the corresponding entities on the European side as well, European Commission, its member states, European Business Organization, embassies, and of course the delegation here in Japan as well. And just before I switch, and I think this is a good tool, not just for the EBC, but I think also it's a good tool for the administrations, because they get in, I was about to say one booklet, now it's on one homepage. They get a good overview of the issues that European industry face here in Japan, and this is also good for us because it means that they will amplify our message when hopefully they report back home, or when they use our white paper in meeting with Japanese authorities. So this is just a couple of those issues that we have it in the 2021 white paper. I'm certain you come from all kinds of different backgrounds, including all different kinds of industry sectors. So I don't necessarily know how much these interest you, but these are some of them. So on this page, I have energy, because as we know, Japan is going through and will have to go through a transformation when it comes to energy. It will have to, if it will fulfill its goal, and actually the goal that is official, which has been announced by the political leadership here in Japan, of going carbon neutral by 2050. It will have to change energy. It's of course not just energy, but energy is one of the more important things. IVD and diagnostics, which sounds like a very unsexy and usual list for all the 20 years that we produced white paper. But of course, with COVID, diagnostics they came on was something like everyone thought of antigen testing. I only need to say antigen testing and PCR testing. And that is, of course, generated by the diagnostics sector. We do know that testing is something that is often said is not done very extensively here in Japan. And this is something the EBC committee is pushing, that there needs to be a proper regulatory framework in order to be able to deal with the challenges that we're currently facing. Defense might actually, because it's such an important sector for France. The defense sector is, as everywhere, fairly special, perhaps even more so here in Japan because of the relationship, both current and historical, Japan has with the US. But we believe that the European defense industry has a role to play here in Japan. There's also, I think I will pass. I actually saw that we have Bernard Delmassier, so maybe I shouldn't skip automotive components, but I will actually do that, and Bernard will have to be upset with me later. Railways is a bit of a special sector here in Japan. We do know, of course, that the railway sector is very well developed here in Japan. We all know that. I think I'm not the only one who thinks that Japanese railway operators, Japanese trains are absolutely fantastic. But it does present some particular problems, some particular challenges for European industry. In that, we'll say all of the industries are regulated by the government in one shape or another. However, railways, especially when it comes to technical standards, these are set up by the individual private companies, and they can be completely different from each and every operator. They're usually not very public either, but often our companies just hand over the products for testing, and they don't necessarily know what kind of testing is going on or why they are approved or why they're not approved. This is something we push very hard from the EBC. HR, I might be similar to what I said a bit about diagnostics. It's perhaps not the most sexy policy area, but of course with entry restrictions, quarantine, people being ill, HR, of course, have become something very important. And the first point, as you can see under HR, is, of course, to allow for the entry for essential personnel. And I think maybe it's the next slide. It is the next slide. We'll come back to the entry restrictions, which I will try to end on. And then, of course, also vaccines, which we all know about. Japan has historically not been a very big vaccine country. The vaccines that I know that some of you are sort of my age, not necessarily straight out of university, but even us that are slightly more experienced, as youngsters in Europe, we've vaccinated not just once or twice or three times, but perhaps with 6 or 7 different vaccines. These semi-mandatory vaccines and the number of them is a fairly modern thing here in Japan. And that's also, and I think this is also part of the problem why Japan was fairly late on vaccination for COVID here in Japan, and why Japanese companies are not particularly strong in this sector. So on to entry restrictions, which doesn't necessarily have any bearing on the EP itself. It's just that this is, for better for worse, what takes up the most of my time and also Valerie's time, meaning the EBC. As I'm certain some of you are experiencing, European companies. This is the #1 issue at the moment and the #1 challenge that European companies are experiencing in the Japanese market currently. So in principle, no new visas are issued. As we speak, we will come after I've just gone through this slide to the 1st of March. And this has been the case for now 2 years. And before you interrupt me, there have been a 3-month period, autumn 2020, and a 3-week period in November last year, but it actually was possible. Like, except for that, it's been basically now 2 years without any new visas issued. So it means that the problem is accumulating. Companies have more and more difficulties replacing personnel that, for whatever reason, left Japan. I should say that the EBC is not arguing to completely open the borders. After all, we are a business organization. But we do ask for the Japanese government to open the borders for business people, both short-term and long-term. This is, of course, nothing the EBC does in complete isolation. Like, we work with anyone that could help the cause, whether it's the ACJ, so the American Chamber, could be any of the chambers. We have actually also worked in joint statements with the French Chamber. We have worked together with the Keidanden, with the Keizai Doyukai, and I also know that Mikitani's organization has also been fairly active. Jane has also been fairly active. This. We are also working directly with some of the European companies to try to get their personnel in, because even if I said, well, I did say in principle, no new visas, it is actually possible to get an exception from this. I won't go as far to say that the EBC has been successful in hundreds and hundreds of cases, absolutely not. But we have actually been successful in, let's say, 10 cases. So that's where we were regarding entry restrictions up until basically last week or this week. As we all know, PM Kishida made an announcement Thursday evening at 7 o'clock last week that Japan will open its border for business, well, for business and students. So maybe this is going too far, but basically any other reason than tourism, there might still be some exceptions that will not be allowed. This should mean that if you independent on whether you represent business, industry, or academia, you should be able to get your people in. You will have to act as a guarantor or a supporter in some sense. It has been said, and this was actually said by Kishida-san himself, that the applications will be done online. We still don't know exactly where the application should be handed in, because during, as I said, it was possible to get in during a 3-month period and also a 3-week period. During that period, applications were handed in to the ministry that was in charge of the industry that you were in. So if you were an auto components manufacturer, well, then it was METI. If you were a telecom company, well, then it could have been Ministry for International Communication, International Affairs and Communication, MIC. If you were in a healthcare center, it would have been MHW, and so on and so forth. This, we don't know yet, despite this is supposed to happen 1st of March, so just in a couple of days. We don't know for certain if everyone will be let in. We do know that there's a cap, 5,000 per day. And this includes everyone that enters Japan, independent of whether it's a new entry, a Japanese citizen, or a foreign resident in Japan, so someone who already lives here. Which means that it's difficult to predict exactly how many new entries are able to get into Japan. There's nothing indicating that each of these categories would get its own quota so far, I should say. So we will just have to, I never like to say wait and see, because that's never a good thing, but at least we'll have to wait and see until there's information released on this. The EBC is, of course, pushing that the 5,000 gap should be amended upwards. We do believe that it's possible to Japan, for Japan to let in an increased amount of people under safe circumstances. Again, we're not completely asking for borders to be completely open. Neither are we asking necessarily for Japan to remove the health protocols under which they are allowed to enter Japan. They have also, in the same announcement, talked about the quarantine itself. Currently, when you enter Japan, there's a 7-day quarantine. There's also included in these, slightly depending from which country you come from, a so-called special, I call it a special quarantine, where you need to stay 3 or 6 days in a hotel, so a designated facility. Among the 6-day countries, we actually had quite a number of European countries, among them France, but also Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, and UK. Many of the other European countries are covered by 3-day. There hasn't necessarily been an explicit announcement what will happen with this special quarantine. There have been announcements that the quarantine will go down from 7 days to 3 days if you provide a negative test on the 3rd day. But whether this special quarantine will disappear completely or not, that hasn't explicitly been mentioned. It hasn't explicitly been mentioned either what kind of tests you need to provide on the 3rd day. As some of you might remember, for a brief period, it was possible, it was back then when we had 2 weeks quarantine. It was possible then for a brief period to do 10-year quarantine if you provided a negative PCR test, which you paid for yourself, and you also got a proper certificate, which you handed in. Currently, we don't know exactly what kind of shape or form you would have to show that you are negative on the 3rd. Should also say that for some countries, this includes some of the European countries, for instance, off the top of my head, Poland, Croatia, I think, and some others as well, you may not have to do quarantine at all. It's been said that you need the booster shot, well, a 3rd shot for this, but the details as of today, and I actually checked this before this, are not yet known.